All right, so we're live here with Ole, who is the author of the O'Reilly book about data catalogs. And make sure I didn't mess up the pronunciation of your name or the title of your book. You want to introduce yourself and talk about your book for a second?
Yeah, thank you, Noah. Thanks for having me on. My name is Ole, as you said, Ole Olesen-Bagneux, my full name, and yeah, I've written a book about data catalogs. The title is the Enterprise Data Catalog. I just also had to recall the title. Um, so the Enterprise Data Catalog is a book that, not surprisingly, about data catalogs. It's appearing here in March in at Aurora. Uh, so just finished writing the book.
How does it feel to finish writing a book? Is it a very stressful journey?
Yeah, it is. It is. This is my first book. Um, I thought about writing books prior to having kids. So when I was in my 20s, um, then I got kids, and just having a career, normal work life, and settling down and everything just took a lot of time, right? And so now that my kids are older, not like teenagers, but I had the time to think about writing a book, and I was fortunate enough to get introduced to an O'Reilly editor with this idea, and yeah, the book was accepted, and the rest is history. But yeah, it's stressful. Yeah, it's very very stressful, but also in a positive way, right? A lot of people reach out, they want to do stuff, suggest things. So I really like that. Just have to manage it because, of course, I also have my like this is a spare time activity, right? So you have to watch out.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well with writing is that it's on one hand it's very rewarding because you get new people to contact with, and you have this thing you produce that you can go to a bookstore and then you see your book in there, and it's super exciting. On the flip side, that what I think a lot of people don't realize is how much work goes into writing a book, and also the stress. Like it really is. It's tremendously stressful because you have to produce on a schedule, and like you said, most people that write books have other things going on. They have a job, family, and it in some ways, at least for me, when I finish writing books, I feel like, wow, man, I'm never doing this again. This was so, like, why did I do this? Like, like it was. But then, like you said, there's the rewarding aspect of it, that does help out.
Yeah, and for me, I think the feeling is like even more intense because it's my first book, right? So I think, of course, writing each book, I guess, is a little different, but it also follows the same pattern of like idea, suggestion, acceptance, development, proofreading, and then publishing, right? And I have to say, I have found that process really, really intense, and so just as rewarding now that it is over, and also a little empty, right? All those nights in front of the laptop, just writing and writing and writing, and now what to do. So, but yeah, I'm really excited about being finished, of course, and the reception of the book is quite magnificent. So I'm very, I feel quite fortunate about that. Yes.
Great. And do you want to maybe summarize in terms of the data catalog, like, why should people care about it? Like, what is the point?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Like so I need to start a little bit with a little more on my background, right? I have a PhD in library and information science, and So, and I've from the University of Copenhagen, and I've also taught courses on knowledge organization, so taxonomies, classification structures, thesauri, ontologies, stuff like that, right? And then on the information seeking part, like the mirroring part of it, like once you've organized all your data or your knowledge or whatever it is, how do you search it again? How do you actually find it? All the techniques, all the technologies, and so forth. And so that's my theoretical background. That's what I did in academia. And then I went into industry. I will spare you my entire resume, right? But at a certain point in time, I was confronted with this technology that was called the data catalog. And I was just looking at all these different sales materials explaining me about like column-based data lineage and all kinds of very cool stuff, but I just had a very difficult time understanding the technology itself. What was it really? I mean, and then I had this, like, I slowly realized that this was just kind of a search engine for companies, for the company data sitting in the empty landscape. And felt quite strongly that I could write about that in a way that would make sense to a lot of people. So serve as an introduction that has not yet been put forward, and that will help many people understand and implement the data catalog. Um, so that was why I wrote the book, and it's written not completely from a data management perspective. It also contains like library information, scientific literature, and there's a slight difference in a traditional data management, the database management approach, and the information scientific approach. So I think that many readers coming from data engineering, data science, and so on, they will also be a little surprised, and hopefully they can use these perspectives and understandings in better implementing data catalogs.
Yeah, that's an interesting, background because one of the things that seems to be different about 2023 is that it's very difficult to find people who admit they read books anymore.
Yeah,
And at least for me, not bragging or anything, but I grew up reading books, and I read
yeah,
sometimes a book every day for years. And I went to the library. I went to the library every summer. We would go to, like huge collections of books. And I would, as a, 10-year-old, I would go in, look at the index cards, find the different books, different things. And I would search in the library for new topics. And to me, I think being able to use a library and find my passion for topics, or I mean, just and even obscure topics. Like I remember when I was maybe 10 or 11, I was at the public library, and there was a whole section on the history of African Americans in the United States in terms of things that they've accomplished. And I just never there was really almost nothing on that subject, right? Like there was in at least in traditional high school they would only teach you about American history, the Pilgrims, right? And you're like, oh, okay, that's all that was going on. And then for the first time, I got to see other kinds of history. I was like, oh wow, what's this? And that was only for me going to the library and searching extremely high quality indexes made by experts
mm,
versus if you look at things like even Google right now, or
mm,
search engines, like are these really high quality indexes of the material that we want people to see versus a library? Almost everything in a library is useful.
yeah,
If you go to the internet, a lot is not useful, and the business model is very is like a very different
yeah,
business model. So I
yeah.
think your background is such an interesting background to apply to this.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. Thank you. Yeah, I still am a big fan of libraries and literature in general. I think so. Yeah. So to brag just a little bit, like you, I also grew up reading a lot of books, and uh, it gives you a certain kind of like solidity. So quite simply, if you read a lot of books and think about a lot of things, you're able to contextualize things that are going on around you in another way than if you just like happen to read like the first page in a newspaper or see some ads and some television shows. It's like Flow TV when we were growing up, right? So yeah, that's something different, right? And the feeling, and so there's an entire theory about uh, how you organize well knowledge, but of course physical libraries, but knowledge ideas, and subsequently when we break it down into big smaller parts, information or data, right? And so the feeling you just described there with the Afro-American history and the achievement that people of those origins have had. Like the discovery that you have at the library there. Maybe you know this from other contexts, but it's really called serendipity, right? This feeling that you stumble upon something, you're extremely surprised about the relevance, importance, and the interest you have in a given topic, and you dive into that topic, you explore it, right? And that's like the wonderful um, effects of serendipity in a library. And so, specifically now we're talking about. So I don't want to get this like uh, this conversation to get all dark, but since we're like juxtaposing that with the internet and everything that's going on online, I mean, with the rise of social media, uh, the the opposition to the opposite of serendipity kind of well, it had existed previously, but it really caught a lot of attention. It's called simplicity. Now, the definition of serendipity is when you find good stuff as a surprise, when you surprisingly discover good stuff that you want to know. And simplicity is the opposite. That's when you find bad stuff you absolutely did not want to know. And online, there's a lot of simplicity, right? There's a lot of hate. There's a lot of like misunderstandings, a lot of undocumented stuff, a lot of rage, and all that is something that we've seen really on the rise with modern technologies, at least for the time being. But I think that we will adjust in the decades to come. But uh, but
Wow.
simplicity, yeah.
Yeah, I have to. Yeah, you just introduced me to a new word. I didn't know that word, but I love it. I mean, the and I think it's interesting because one of the critiques that I have with what's happening with social media is that it is actually an algorithmic problem that is
Mm.
under the control of the companies. So they know what they're doing. It isn't like it's impossible to stop, like you mentioned. How do you pronounce it again? It's called
Simplicity.
sublimity,
Sim, uh,
simp
simplicity.
simplanity. Okay,
Yeah.
you basically. It seems like that's actually the. Um, I'll have to pronounce that a few times to get it
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
But essentially the recommendation engine in some sense is like is an opposite, like you mentioned, of serendipity. It's almost like the unintentional effects, or now whether it was intentional or not, because it increases engagement, but that's the result, is basically bad content. So people are constantly exposed to bad content, which is the opposite of a library, literally the opposite.
yeah, yeah. You're right. You're right. And so the interesting thing I think about my background, not me personally, but like the educational background I have, is that library information science was a field that was like 30, 40 years ago, it was basically just librarians getting academic, right? But then something happened to libraries because of modern technology. Libraries weren't that important anymore. Like it wasn't the sole source of information. Like you could with the rise of the web in the early 1990s, we began searching online and became more and more important. Then books got digitized to a higher degree, and that resulted in physical books and physical libraries becoming even less important, right? And so two things kind of happened with my discipline, like my academic discipline. There were some people that just stayed in this realm of like physical libraries, physical books. We've been doing this for centuries. We need to keep on doing that. And there were a lot of people that understood that this is not going to go away. We have to adapt to a totally new technology landscape. But we have a lot to offer to that landscape. I mean, we understand taxonomies, ontologies, thesauri. We understand and define, for crying out loud, RDF, right? So we understand the nature of the web. Let's use that to actually provide structure and guidance for the web. And so I think in the beginning of the web in the 1990s, there was this big movement and idea towards like more enlightenment, even in a European philosophical dimension to the web. Like you wanted to really even an artistic dimension to that. We wanted to bring a lot of ideas, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of hope into the web, and that quite fast got commercialized into a structure that was not really aiming at like spreading ideas and knowledge, or at least not only, but also just like providing a platform for consumerism, which is something like I wouldn't oppose that, but it's just something less idealistic, right?
Yeah, I think a good example would be, if you left a child that was between 10 to 18 in a library, there's the probability of them having some kind of bad outcome as a result of this is almost zero,
Mm.
right? Like you could expose them to the library, essentially infinite times over a 10-year horizon daily, and only their life will get better. If
Yeah,
you
of course.
infinitely create simulations of 10-year-olds to 18-year-olds with no constraints onto the internet, probably the opposite, right? Like the more unconstrained,
Yeah.
the worse it is.
Yes, yes. I gotta. I can't disagree in that. That's pretty horrible to put it like that, but it's not. I mean, I agree. That's that's just a horrible fact, and you can even like, if you really want to go down that road, there's a lot of like interesting things within the field of librarianship back in the days. For example, the freedom of access to information, like the right of actually obtaining information in a free way. We think of that as in like the technologists, right? Right. So we think of that as a technical discipline, like you can discuss a data mesh or data fabric or stuff like that. But what does it even mean in a societal context? And for example, like back in the days, there was this there was this oath that librarians had to take that they wouldn't expose the information seeking behaviors
Mm.
of the users of the library. So if the police came and asked, okay, this citizen, what kind of books has this person taken home with him or her? Then it was actually an oath that the librarian would not answer the police because we have the freedom to obtain the information we want. Now, if you want to compare that with having our entire entire browser history logged, it's quite a difference, right? I mean, so understanding access to information is purely a technical thing is definitely not wrong. We should discuss that, but there's also this ethical dimension to it where you actually like think of what does it actually mean to have free access to information? What does that actually mean? I mean, is that simply a technical thing? Because if it is, what's the freedom in it? If you left all your data to someone, it's going to use that for a variety of purposes. Then what's the freedom in it?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing you bring up. I mean, I think at least the culture of the United States, there's been historically books that people have always flagged, like Catcher in the Rye is a perfect one, where it's like, oh, you read Catcher in the Rye, oh, you're on the watch list, and Catcher in the Rye is a classic. It's
Mm-hmm.
essentially like a very fascinating book that's timeless in many ways, and it's a great piece of literature. But to make some kind of classification that someone that read it is needs to be watched, or books by Karl Marx, or any kind of historical book where maybe even like bad historical figures, like Stalin, etc.
Mm-hmm.
That reading their works doesn't, just because someone wants to read what someone wrote, it doesn't mean they agree with it, right? That they could be
Yeah,
wanting to
absolutely.
understand it so they can make a critique of it, or summarize it. But if you're exposing people's thought process before they even get to the conclusion, that almost gets into like a science fiction movie, like even the original Twilight Zone. I remember when I was a child, I watched one where I believe the episode was a kid had too high of an IQ, and so he was in trouble because he was thinking too much, and there was
Hmm.
some kind of bad outcome. I forget what the plot of the movie was, but this idea that you want to watch what people are thinking.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, with the internet, that's actually one of the unintended consequences.
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. I mean, we can totally do that. And yeah, we're getting off topic in relation
Yeah.
to my book, but I don't mind at all because I think like this is interesting. I have this like ethical discussion at the end of my book, a philosophical discussion, if you want, because like data catalogs as a search engine will at some point reach those ethical dilemmas that we have today on the web, like being able to trace feelings and um, negative intentions, hatred, and such through search is something that will, I believe, occur also more in companies going forward with the technologies that are being introduced, but also so we simply need the same kind of ethical mechanisms that are, of course, they are rising right on the web. It's not something that is not like it's being addressed. It's being addressed with all the regulations that we are making primarily here in Europe, but the rest of the world seem to want to do that as well now. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of things I could comment on here. First of all, I have read Catcher in the Rye, but I have never like there was never anyone before you that have said that it's a controversial. I mean, of course a very artistic book. It has a lot of literary quality. So, but I just thought that people read it because of its literary quality. I didn't know it was a controversial book actually in the U.S. at least, but apparently so.
Yeah, I think I mean, obviously every country has got a different culture, and America has actually gone through many periods of I guess kind of like a mass hysteria, right? And so there was a period of time where people were very concerned about communism, and
Hmm.
so there was the McCarthyism, and you know that whole period of time. And then there's been other periods where there's been complaints against wars, and I think it could just be that books certain they just seem to crop up, if they have mass appeal and they're unique books that someone who's typically not well read wants to ban them. So I mean, in my opinion, almost that's a great place to start about looking for a great book to read as an adult. I don't know about a child, but as an adult, if a book has been banned, it's like, well, let's consider this. It's like almost like if you wanted to randomly pick a good topic, well, someone was bothered by it, so there must be something useful in this book. Maybe we should read it.
I think Noah. I mean, I wanna like it has very little, close to nothing to do with my book. What I wanna say now, but it's just like I think we're getting down something very interesting, an interesting path here. And so one of the things that perhaps is a little different from being European than an American is that um, I think we approach liberty of expression differently as societies. Uh, in Europe, we have this very old tradition of having like newspapers, very established newspapers. They came about like yeah prior to the birth of the United States. We had our first newspapers, and we also had our first publishing houses. And so there was a quite strict control mechanism that was loosened over the decades and centuries leading up to the Enlightenment in the second half of the 18th century. Now, this is not a history lesson, of course. It's a tech podcast. But the reason I'm saying this is because I think that, for example, libraries, physical libraries, if you think of that place, why is that a place that is going to educate a child and push that child forward, help that child in becoming a civilized adult? It's because everything in there has been curated, not only as a collection, but also as publications. The newspapers that that child would find in that library had editors, an editor-in-chief. Every one of those editors would be responsible for what was in the newspaper, and they would have to appear in front of court of law if something in their newspaper was false and damaging to a person or to the society as a whole. And the same goes for the books that were in that library. They would have had an editor, and that editor would have worked at a publishing house, and that publishing house would have had a responsible editor-in-chief, and that editor-in-chief could be put into prison if something that was published in that publishing house was false. Now, that did not come about overnight. That took decades, even centuries to evolve. And it created a systems wherein several systems of publication, of disseminating of information, wherein what could be found in those books and papers could be trusted. It was trustworthy information, things that we could actually believe. And so what we're seeing every time a new medium is introduced is that it's unregulated. Technology always um, evolves prior to the regulation that controls that technology. That's the nature of technology, of course, and of human progress. And so the regulations always try to do that. They also always try to regulate too late. And that is why every new medium has this, I'd say, anti-democratic tendency born into it, because every time a new medium, look what Hitler did with radio and what he did with movies, right? He was a mastermind in using those mediums because they were completely unregulated and he could manipulate the masses with them. I won't make a direct parallel with anyone in the present, but look at who were very capable of using like new unregulated media in a not so distant past, right? I mean, you can push, like, I will mention Breitbart News, for example. It's not a newspaper. Breitbart News is not a newspaper. And the reason why it's not a newspaper is because it does not have to appear in front of a court of law. It's considered telecommunications, right? So it's not a newspaper. It's not something where you have to appear in front of a court of law. That has changed very, very recently with conspiracy theorists now actually being condemned for the lies that they're spreading, right? But actually, new technology is in this place, in this vacuum where you can put forward whatever you want. It's a totally unfiltered reality, and no one is actually controlling that. And we call that freedom of expression, but it's not. It's freedom of writing. You don't have that distinction in English, but it's very, very. So you could express it as something like this. It's freedom of printing, of actually typing
Mhm.
on a on a on a on a on a on a laptop or whatever you have. You have the freedom to type whatever you want, but it's not the freedom of expression. The freedom of expression philosophically is something where you have to accept that whatever you say is something that you should be able to defend in a court of law as something that is not harmful or just a lie.
Yeah, wow. That's a great a great. I mean, I think this is still on the topic of your book because
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
yeah,
It is. It is.
and the I think when you bring up the unregulated, uncurated media sources, I recently read several books about the rise of fascism,
Mm-hmm.
and in particular Mussolini as well
Mm-hmm.
was actually a old time radio person. So that was he was in media as well, and so there was fascism and new media are quite friendly, and there's actually over a century of or yeah, I think it's been close to a century of time in the saddle, so to speak, to expose that. And this, I think the curation is such a great point where, if, would a response, if you randomly selected 1,000, educated adults globally, what would they, like, to your point, what would they, even if they weren't trained as a librarian, what would they put into, a curated source of a repository of information? It would be very little of what we find on the internet, right? Like
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
people wouldn't want their children to see, newspapers that are basically designed to enrage people and spread, misinformation for profit. And that I think is such an interesting point of taking the physical library system, and then if you apply it to a company as well, where, I think in the early days of data engineering, everybody's, oh, data engineering, it's amazing, yay, awesome, data, more data, and then if you're just throwing garbage around, and nobody in the company has actually curated it and
Mm-hmm.
qualified it and, categorized it so that it's actually, you're like, look, no, this is useful information, and here's how you can use it. It's such an interesting point that I have to admit I've never really thought about that concept in terms of, people's data in a
Yeah.
company.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So it's definitely something where, I mean, I do consider so the negative one, simplicity, as something that is it would be hard to stumble upon that in a data catalog than on, say, Facebook. But it's not impossible, right? I mean, people have a strong tendency to express negative feelings towards each other if they have a chance through, through digital media. Um, but there is this, like, I think many data catalogs promote this idea of data intelligence, and I actually think that's a quite um, clever way of expressing how we should approach data, right? That it's something that, I mean, of course, we can think of it as something very mechanical that we can just trust data, become more efficient, and so on. But it's also something where we can put into context what this data is about, if it really is reliable and useful, and can actually bring us forward, right? So I think I think that's actually one of the great elements of a data catalog is that it is a technology component. It is not a silver bullet, but it is a technology component in the idea of creating a more data literate and a data intelligent company. So instead of this mess, um, I won't describe it as something that is as negative as the reality online, right? Going at work is something where like the, the, the negative dimensions of your IT landscape is more rooted in efficacy and like the impossibility of executing and too high costs of data. So you have to look deeper to find. Of course, there's politics and manipulation in a data in a company. Of course, there is. You have to look a little deeper than online, right? But I think the data catalog, nevertheless, is a component that contributes to a deeper, more meaningful understanding of the data and 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 hence the present and also the past of your company, quite frankly.
Hmm. Yeah, and the other thing that is interesting about comparing the cruder algorithmic only ways of classifying data is that if it seems like a recommendation engine, if it was an alternative to a data catalog, in some ways could be tragic because it, it depends on really the context of the data that's going into the system. Like if the if you asked some people that were having trouble in school or maybe needed some guidance about their life, etc., and you collected all those people and you had them share the content that they're interested in to other people, that would actually not be useful. That would actually not, that would be the opposite of useful, right? But on the
Yeah,
flip side,
yeah.
if you're having experts categorize things in a way so that it's essentially immutable. Like there's no way to create a bad outcome as a result of the curation, which is what I think a library really is. It's a way of almost making like a bulletproof mechanism to share information because of all the
Mhm.
things you mentioned that I didn't know about, like that there's an accountability, right, where
Mhm.
people are held accountable for what they're putting there. And you're actually makes me think your ideas about the library science going into data really is gets me thinking about even search engines of today. Like
Mhm.
imagine, could there be a new search engine that a government or a nonprofit set up that was curated? I
Mhm.
guess essentially like Wikipedia, but maybe even but more of an aggregate, more of a larger form of Wikipedia. I mean, that could really be helpful to people.
It could, and so if we just scroll back to what I said, like in the beginning of the conversation, with this division of the library and information scientific field back in, I guess back in the late 90s, right? I mean, there were these two camps. That's the one part of like this field. They said, okay, we want to stay with libraries. That's what we do. We maintain libraries. And the other one that was like going into the technology space, saying we have to adapt to this new reality. But you kind of also understand the nostalgic part, right? I mean, the library system that was built, and it was actually primarily built in the U.S. I mean, the modern library systems, they were invented by this movement in the U.S. back in the late 19th century, and going a little into the 20th century as well. And the idea was this intense information campaign, or like educational campaign for everyone in like everyone in society, that they could go in there and they could just educate themselves. The idea was not to read good books like novels and stuff. I mean, they were accepted later, but the idea was this big information campaign where we wanted to educate, really intensely educate everyone in society for the better of everyone, right? For the better of all. And so that idea, abandoning that because technology was making it irrelevant to some people that had that calling to them. That I can understand that that hurt a lot. I mean, that hurt a lot for those people uh, because that was like you can still find them online. I mean, you can still find those. There literally is an oath that you can swear that you will not like pass on whatever information searching habits people have and so forth to the authorities. And there are many things like that. They still like they're still to be found out there. Um, so leaving all that behind because technology made it irrelevant was very very difficult. But I think that yeah. So in a longer historical perspective, I think that what will happen in the next decades or so is that we will get we will not like I'm not a regulator, and I don't want to regulate anything for the sake of regulation, but I think that we will at some point reach a state for the open web where we cannot accept anymore people that have no expertise or knowledge or just have uh, like evil intentions, that they are capable of getting big platforms where they can just spread whatever miss of this information they feel like. We will reach a level of civilization where that is no longer possible, and we are seeing many things that are pointing in that direction, right? I mean, um, we are seeing it with, for example, the the fact that Infowars was taken down. We are seeing it with the ban of, um, yeah, I'll say his name, Donald Trump from Twitter and social media in general. I know he's back, but let's see what the future of Twitter is, because it's another thing, right? If you have very rich people approaching like social media, they approach it they approach it as a consumer platform. So they they aren't capable of making the distinction between being a, a citizen and being a consumer. It's something as a social media. It's not you can't just be a consumer of ideas. You have to act as a citizen and have to respect civilization at another level if you wanna have a meaningful social medium, and Twitter definitely was part of that movement of going towards a more civilized way of having debate and political exchange of views, but that was that was stuffed with uh, with Elon Musk. But I think his ideas were not completely off, but you can't regulate it as something that it's not. It is a place where you exchange ideas.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to talk a little bit about how the European um, Union, in particular, really seems to, in many ways, be the leaders and thought leaders. I think in what's happening with data governance, regulation, and that I think is one of the aspects of American society that's always been so strange to me, is that we don't seem to care about as much, things that Europe is caring about, and like data privacy, like you can't send the data to some other location, and personally identifiable information. If it gets leaked, there's severe consequences for it. And so, in many ways, it would be interesting to see if Europe becomes essentially the leaders in uh, coming up with ideas for how could you take the current mess we're in and make it better. Because I don't think the ideas from the United States have from the birth of social media have really panned out, to be honest.
No, I agree. I mean, it makes me think of this joke that's not really funny, but anyway, it's this like three guys walk into a bar and they decide to do information technology, and so the Chinese says, "I do the hardware," the American says, "I do the software," and then the European says, I do the regulation." Right? And yeah, so it's not that funny of a joke, but it's true. It's just yeah. So I will answer your question, but I think that we as Europeans, I mean, we should get better at hardware and software. We're not good enough in that. We're getting better. We're actually getting quite a lot better these years, at least on the software side. But we should get even better. But yeah, I think that there are being um, amendments made to GDPR currently that will further like emphasize its its potential, its strength, and yeah, we definitely haven't seen the last parts here. But I think several states are catching up nicely with California in particular, but more states also in the US are catching up with Europe in this regard. I wish we could all do hardware, software, and regulations. I think we should collaborate on all those things globally. But I guess that right now it is Europe that is really leading in that respect.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know there's this mentality that Americans are the most entrepreneurial, companies, or but on the flip side, you could say, well, but of what, right? Like, what have you produced? And if you look at two cars, for example, um, so this is maybe a good analogy. I actually did own a Mercedes C34 that had autonomous driving, maybe 2 3 years ago, and it was for what it was sold as, which is you follow vehicles in front of you. It was good. It was very good. And if you look at German engineering, they the odds of there being problems are just so low,
Mm.
especially for a brand like Mercedes. Just the quality is just exceptional. So there's obviously examples. That's a pretty good example of the regulation, the hardware, and the software all essentially in a package, really really out competing
Mm.
other cars. And then if we look at some of the things that are going on with Tesla, and I've been invited there, in person, and I've seen some of the things. I would say the engineers are amazing, like brilliant people. But if you took look at the three things we discussed, the hardware, the software, the governance, I think many people, and I would put myself in this category, would say the governance is lacking, right? So in the case of autonomous vehicles, one of the biggest critiques is that the pedestrians didn't sign a waiver, right? That the pedestrians on their bike or walking across the streets didn't like sign up for the potential risk of dying, being exposed to autonomous vehicle, right? That isn't you know a form that's been filled out everywhere. So the difference between America and the way they do things versus Europe is, and I don't know how Mercedes does testing for their autonomous software, but my hunch is it's done in a very controlled environment,
Mm.
where in the US there is no controls. Essentially, it's right. I mean, it literally there's by design, it's a free for all. And I think that could be a situation where there were short-term rewards that people got from following the American model, but it could be that the companies that have um, got benefits from this in a short-term way, they may long-term not be around. And I'm curious about the social media companies in America that have propagated, as you mentioned, like Alex Jones is a perfect example, where he was essentially spread, according to the Social Dilemma documentary, like more than the combined output of all major newspapers by some, some factor. I don't know the exact number, but basically he was recommended at least the same level, if not more, by these social media companies. And it's like that's a lack of curation, right? And then
Yeah,
what are the consequences to the brand of not having good data catalog, right? Like there should have
yeah,
been a data catalog where like this is not a source that should ever be exposed or recommended in any capacity.
yeah, yeah. It's yeah. There really is nothing good to say about Alex Jones, but there was, for me at least, quite a lot of joy in watching him not being allowed to tell his lies in front of a judge. I think um, it shouldn't have gone that far, right? Because, but I guess that's, I mean, it's something where like we're, it's both very related to my book and very much not related to the book. And it's not, I don't, it's not because I want to promote my book that I'm mentioning it. It's just like I don't hope the listeners get too excited and buy my book and then there's nothing about this topic in my book. But so it's more of by because of that I mentioned it. But I think this entire um, at least that's the tradition I was trained in, or the discipline that I was trained in, really thinking about like the trustworthy sources, how you expose them, how you make them available, how you can search them, what they will do for people, and so on. And the genre as a catalog, that really is the key to a collection of knowledge, of ideas, of things that can educate you and push you forward, right? And so those are the methodologies that I have understood from various catalogs and that I've put into this book, so that it's not just, I mean, a lot of the documentation on data catalogs is very, very technical, right? But the idea of catalog is something as a gateway or whatever you want to call it to a collection of ideas, of knowledge, and ultimately of data. That is something that has a deeper philosophical meaning to it, and that's rooted in everything that we've discussed. That is going very much on. But I think that, yeah, I think if we should tie it all together, I think that the web, the open web, needs a data catalog more than it needs a commercial search engine, right? Because
Hmm.
it's very, very, uh, yeah, to be honest, it's quite dangerous for society not to have it. We can see the first consequences of that. But I remain an optimist. I think that civilization and good ideas will will win this, as we have done in the past. Every new medium goes through this stage. That was like the first laws against not being able to publish lies in books were actually made in Denmark, in my country. I live in Copenhagen, Denmark, and the first lies of like all the first laws stating that you shouldn't be allowed to print lies and circulating lies on print. They were actually written in Denmark. So so every new medium has that. The internet as well. We just have to it has to take some time before people realize that it's simply too dangerous to be able to, like, freedom of speech is not just saying whatever.
Yeah, and it's interesting that if you look at some of um, the mottos of companies, American tech companies, they'll have these like grand visions like organizing the world's data, and I think is one of the one of the mottos of Google. And there's a lot that Google has done well, but again, going back to the lack of curation for Alex Jones, that isn't organizing the world's information. That's actually, as you mentioned before, the opposite of serendipity. You're creating, a problem that needs to get cleaned up. And I think it's a very, I mean, just to kind of tie everything together, I think it's such an interesting topic to bring up, where, I think that people in the data space should read your book, because I think your philosophical background is a very unique approach to data engineering. And then B, I think it opens up many, uh, I think, ideas about, how can companies compete in the future? Is it just going to be that you went faster, move fast and break things? Because there are obvious consequences to moving fast. And is there a way to compete where you actually are more holistic about you're careful about what you're producing so that it's high quality? And then, as you mentioned, C, which is in terms of the search engines, is the future of search engines actually curated search engines that have some ability to essentially eliminate the effect of low quality information through a data catalog? I think that's what I got out of our conversation. I think it would be amazing if those things happened.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. Thank you for this beautiful like conclusion on our talk. And yeah, it was really, really, really interesting talking to you. I think this has been a very special conversation, and I really enjoyed you asking questions that made us go into directions that were a little different than what I normally talk about, and just talk more closely about the various chapters in my book. But this is definitely something that I think is very, very important, and yeah, that is, in particular, the last part of my book has this philosophical and futuristic take on what can happen, also for society in general, on these kinds of technologies. Um, I think search engines and the way we interact with them exposes the good and the bad inside us, and equally so. So it's up to us to decide how we want to use this technology. Um, and I remain an optimist. I am very, very certain that we will be able to create good technological, sustainable solutions that will be regulated in a way so they push our societies forward. So just answering your questions, so yes, I am 100% optimistic. I think that in a decade or two from now, we may even be able to let our 10-year-olds just walk around online, seeing whatever they want, because it's safer, more educational,
Hmm.
and better for them. But it will take time. It will take a lot of time. And
Yeah, and one last thought I was going to mention to you, that you're reminding me of something that I had thought about maybe a year ago, was that if the difference between reading a book and reading something online is you can actually mathematically calculate one of the problems with reading stuff online, is that, if you say, like, for example, your book, you probably took at least a year to write it, right? So a book takes between 1 to 10 years to write, and so you're essentially getting, every time you read something, you're multiplying this knowledge that took years to acquire, right? Like, or someone took 10 years to write, like a classic book, or 20 years to write. I don't know how long it took to write Moby Dick. Let's just say 10 years. I don't know. I'm assuming, like, and you just say 10 times in, right? And you say, like, you get this huge number, and then you say, someone on BuzzFeed or Breitbart took 30 seconds, maybe they use some chat GPT and they put something, one number will be much higher in terms of the years of knowledge it took to create that. So, and it's basically the equivalent of what you just said, right? With the data catalog is it's essentially a weighted number about the quality of a resource, right? Like how many years and how much quality is associated with it. So it's an interesting. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, the years it took to write something
No,
and
no,
multiply it.
not in that way. My problem has always been a little more simple, right? That you can't read all the books in the world.
Sure.
So how many books can you actually read in the course of a lifetime, right? And but I haven't thought of it like that. I like that better. I think it's way better to think of like accumulated knowledge in that respect. And I totally agree with the fact that like it's matured thoughts that has taken a lot of time before it has been published. And if it's a scientific paper, it has been peer reviewed, and if it's a book, it has been reviewed by an editor back and forth. And yeah, that is definitely more trustworthy information.
Great. Well, thanks again for chatting. And I have to admit, I'm really excited to read your book now. So I'm gonna probably read it in the next few weeks here, and I'll definitely let you know what I think.
Thank you, Noah. And for the listeners out there, I want to say that the discussion that we've had on this podcast is very much linked to the last part of my book. If they are a little impatient to get into that kind of feeling of more philosophical, more intellectual discussion, but I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And I am eager to know what you think of it.
Sounds good. Okay. Have a great night. I know it's late there.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
Okay. Talk to you later. Bye.